In 2025, a Chinese animated film did something no film had ever done. It crossed $2 billion at the box office. It passed Frozen, passed every film Disney had ever released, and climbed into the 5 highest-grossing movies ever made. Its hero is not a soldier or a king. He is a small, furious child with wheels of fire under his feet. The creed that audiences carried out of the theater, the line that became the whole series' signature, is that his fate belongs to him and not to heaven. He decides what he becomes. No parent, no God, no destiny chooses it for him. That is the boy the world fell in love with. He is also 3,000 years old, and the same legend that gave that defiant child his voice has him do something the films only ever show in shadow. To save his mother and his father from execution, this boy takes a blade to his own body and gives it back, piece by piece, to the parents who made it. He unmakes himself, deliberately, completely, as a son repaying the debt of his own birth. So which one is he? The most devoted son in all of Chinese myth? A child who literally returned his body to the parents who gave it? Or its most famous rebel, who killed a god's son, defied the heavens, and then refused even the flesh he was born in? This is the legend of Nalanda. Not the film, but the far older story underneath it, the one the film is built on. It carries a question that a civilization built on obedience to one's parents has never quite settled. We are not going to settle it either. We are going to walk it, from an impossible birth to a God still worshipped today, and leave the verdict with you. To understand the argument, you have to start before he could even speak. The story we are following comes mainly from a 16th century novel called Feng Shen Yan Yi, The Investiture of the Gods. It is fiction, a sprawling mythological epic written more than 2,000 years after the era it imagines. And we are going to treat it as exactly that, a legend, not a record. In that legend, Nu Jia is born at a military fortress called Chentong Pass in the last violent years of the Shang Dynasty. His father, Li Jing, is the commander of the garrison, a serious career soldier. His mother is Lady Yin, and her pregnancy does not behave like a pregnancy. It lasts 3 years and 6 months. When it finally ends, she does not give birth to a child. She gives birth to a ball of flesh, a sphere of pale light that rolls across the floor of the room. Li Jing, a practical man and a frightened one, draws his sword and cuts it open. Out of it steps a boy, already able to walk, already wrapped in 2 strange objects, a gold ring around his arm, and a length of red silk that the story calls the Red Armillary Sash. He is not really their son, not entirely. He is the incarnation of a spirit pearl, a heavenly being placed into human form, destined to help bring down the Shang. A master immortal named Tie Zhenren takes him as a disciple and gives him a name, Nu Jia. So from his first breath, he is a paradox the legend never resolves. He is a gift to his parents, and a stranger in their house, a miracle and an omen, a child who was sent, not made, and he is about to learn that a boy who was sent by heaven can still bring heaven down on the people who raised him. He is 7 years old when it happens, and it begins with something as ordinary as the heat. It is summer, and Chentong Pass is baking. So Nu Jia goes down to the river to cool off. He takes the red silk sash, the one he was born holding, and dips it into the water to wash. The silk is not an ordinary cloth. As soon as it touches the river, the water begins to shake. The tremor runs all the way down, into the sea, into the crystal palace of Ao Guang, the Dragon King of the Eastern Sea. To a Dragon King, this is not a child at play. The foundations of his world are shaking. He sends a scout up to find the source, a Yaksha, an armored demon soldier named Li Gun. The Yaksha surfaces, sees a boy, and speaks to him with the contempt a king's soldier has for a peasant child. Nujia answers by killing him. One strike of the gold ring, and the Dragon King's scout is dead in the shallows. This is the first thing you have to weigh. He did not defend himself against a monster. He was insulted, and he killed the Dragon King's own soldier and felt no fear at all. When the Dragon King's son, a prince named Ao Bing, comes up himself, riding a great beast at the head of his father's troops, the fight is longer, but it ends the same way. Nujia overcomes him, strikes him down, and the Dragon Prince dies, his true serpent form breaking out of him in his final agony. A 7-year-old boy has now killed a son of the Dragon Kings, the guardians of the sea and the rain, beings who answer to heaven itself. And the Dragon King does not go to war first, he goes to court. Ao Guang, the grieving father, transforms himself and travels up to the very gates of heaven to bring his complaint to the Jade Emperor, and have this murdering child punished by the highest authority there is. But Nujia gets there first. In the novel, he ambushes the Dragon King at the southern gate, overpowers him, and tears the scales from his body, humiliating one of the oldest guardians of the cosmos, like a street thief. It is one thing to kill a dragon prince in the heat of a fight. It is another to lie in wait for his grieving father at the threshold of the heavens. By now, Nujia has not simply broken a rule. He has announced that nothing, not the sea, not the sky, not even the safety of his own family, stands above his will. The 4 Dragon Kings stop asking for justice and come to take it. They gather over Chentong Pass, and they descend on the one place that can truly hurt him, not the boy himself, but the mother and the father who raised him. This is the moment the whole legend turns on, and it is worth slowing down for, because everything before it has been leading here, and everything after it flows out of it. But first you have to understand what a parent meant in this world, or the act loses all its weight. In the Confucian tradition that shaped China, filial piety, the duty a child owes the people who raised them, was not one virtue among many. It was the root of all of them, the foundation a whole civilization was built on. An old line from the classic of filial piety puts it plainly: your body, your hair, your skin, every part of you was received from your parents. To keep it whole and unharmed is the very beginning of filial duty. Your body, in other words, was never fully your own. It was a gift held on loan, a debt you spent your entire life repaying through obedience and care, and even to scar it was a small betrayal of the people who gave it to you. That is the idea Nujia is about to take in his hands and turn into a blade. The 4 Dragon Kings come to Chentong Pass with a single demand: a life for a life. Their prince is dead, and they will drown the entire region, and they will see Li Jing and Lady Yin executed unless the debt is paid. And here is the cruelty inside it. By the law these people lived under, children were not separate from their parents. A child's crime was the parent's crime. Nujia's killing was, in the eyes of that world, his father's failure and his mother's shame. The parents were going to die for what the son had done. Nujia hears this, and he makes a decision that no 7-year-old should ever have to make, and that the legend has been arguing about ever since. He chooses to pay the debt with the only thing that is fully his to give: his body. In front of the Dragon Kings, in front of his parents, he takes a blade to himself. He cuts open his own belly and returns his flesh to his mother. He breaks his own bones apart and gives them back to his father. The phrase the tradition uses is precise and unbearable: to return the flesh to the mother, to return the bone to the father. He is giving back, piece by piece, the body they made, so that the debt of his birth is cancelled, and they cannot be punished for a son who no longer, in any physical sense, belongs to them. But the story refuses to choose how to read what just happened. On one hand, this is filial piety taken to its absolute limit. The highest virtue this culture knew was a child's devotion to their parents, the debt owed for the body and the life they gave. Nujia pays that debt to the letter with his own flesh, dying so they can live. There is no more devoted act imaginable. On the other hand, look again. He is rejecting the body his parents gave him. He is unmaking their creation. He is saying, in the most violent way a child can, that this creation, this debt, is broken and can no longer bind him. The paradox is held in the same breath. That is the weight Nujia holds in his hands. Devotion and rebellion, one blade, held in tension. And so we leave it. The boy returns his flesh. The boy returns his bone. The child dies so the parents can live. Or is he unmaking them? The story never says. Filial piety and rebellion never resolved. That he will not be bound by the flesh he was born into, not even to stay alive in it. The most obedient thing he ever does, and the most defiant thing he ever does, turn out to be a single motion, a single cut. And he is not finished. Because in this story, death is not where Nujia ends, it is where he stops belonging to anyone. After he dies, his soul drifts, homeless, with no body to return to, and nowhere to be reborn. It is his old master, the immortal Tie Genren, who answers, and what he does quietly decides the whole argument. He does not restore the body Nujia gave away. He builds a new one. He takes lotus roots and lotus leaves and shapes them into a human form, and he places Nujia's soul inside it. Nujia comes back, but he comes back as something made of the lotus, the flower that grows clean out of the mud, the old symbol of a thing reborn pure and free of whatever came before. Think about what that means inside this family. The first body, the one that took 3 years to grow, was his parents' gift, and it carried his debt to them. This second body owes them nothing. It was not made by his mother and father. It was made by his master out of a flower. He is the same soul, but he is no longer in any sense the law recognized, their son. He has, in the most complete way possible, decided for himself what he is made of. With the new body come new weapons, the ones every version of him carries, 2 wheels of wind and fire that he stands on to fly, and a spear tipped with flame. He returns harder, free of the debt and free of the fear. In some tellings, his first act is to go looking for his father, furious, and Li Jing has to be handed a pagoda, a tower, by a higher power just to keep his own son in check. That is why, in Chinese tradition, Li Jing is remembered as the pagoda-bearing heavenly king, the father who needed a magic tower to hold his boy. A son who returned his body to his parents, then built a new one that owed them nothing, then turned on the father who raised him. Devotion and rebellion again, refusing to come apart. And this is where the legend does its strangest thing of all. This furious, self-made, parent-defying child, the boy who rejected the very flesh his parents gave him, does not end up remembered as a warning. He ends up worshipped as a god, on hundreds of altars, by parents who pray to him to keep their own children safe. How, then, does the boy who broke every bond become the one people trust to guard them? To answer that, the story has to step out of the novel and into something you can actually visit, because Nujia is not only a character. He is a god people still pray to, and his beginnings are stranger than the films ever let on. The name itself did not start in China. Scholars trace it back to a Buddhist figure, a Yaksha prince named Nalakubara, who came east along the same roads as Buddhism itself, out of India, and was slowly, over centuries, absorbed and rewritten. The lotus rebirth, the Taoist master, the whole shape of the legend we just followed, those are later Chinese and Taoist layers, grown over a much older, foreign root. A god who began as an outsider became one of the most Chinese figures imaginable, and the more foreign and rebellious his story, the more fiercely he was claimed. In Taoism, he holds a formal rank. He is the marshal of the central altar, a title that ranks him among the great protective deities, in a tradition that also venerates Matsu, goddess of the sea, and Guandi, the god of war and loyalty. The contradiction sits inside the title itself. The boy who made war on the guardians of heaven is now counted as one of them, a protector instead of a threat. Nowhere is he more alive than in Taiwan and the coastal province of Fujian. When immigrants crossed the dangerous strait to Taiwan, they carried this child god with them as a guardian against the sea and the unknown. And today the island holds more than 370 temples to him. On his feast day in parts of Fujian, people lift his statue and cross a barrier of fire barefoot, asking him for peace. And in modern Taiwan, he has been reborn one more time, into something his makers could never have pictured. They call him the Electric Third Prince. Young performers in giant Naja costumes dance to thudding electronic music at festivals and street processions, an ancient deity turned into pure, defiant energy. So here the contradiction comes to its point. A foreign prince who became a Chinese god. A child who killed the guardian of heaven, who rejected the body his parents made, who turned on his own father, and who is worshipped sincerely on hundreds of altars by people asking him to protect their children. The rebel is the guardian. The boy who broke every bond is the one they trust to keep them safe. So, we come back to where we started, with the question we promised not to answer. Was Nujia the most devoted son in Chinese myth, or its most famous rebel? The honest reply is that the legend has survived 3,000 years precisely because it will not choose. He returned his flesh to his mother and his bone to his father, the purest act of devotion a child could offer. And he built himself a new body that owed them nothing, the purest act of defiance a child could commit. Both are true. They were always the same blade. Maybe that is the real reason a 3,000-year-old boy became the biggest film in Chinese history at this exact moment. The line the films made famous, the one the first of them gave him, that his fate is his to decide and not heaven's, feels brand new. It feels like something only this generation could say out loud, but it is the oldest thing in the story. It was already there in a 7-year-old at Chentong Pass, paying his parents' debt with his own body and then refusing to stay inside it. We like to think devotion and rebellion are opposites, that you either honor where you came from or you break free of it. Nujia is the figure who refuses that choice, who insists you can do both at once, give everything back, and still belong to no one but yourself. The old red altar and the glowing movie screen are showing the same face. And the question they leave on it is not really about a god at all. It is the one every child eventually carries. How much do you owe the people who made you? And how much of yourself do you get to keep? The legend will not answer that. It just hands the question very gently over to you to carry from here.